Good video on valve cover gasket replacement. First thing you need to do is remove the cabin filter housing. I have a separate video on that one. You can have a look at that. And then after that, we need to remove these 10mm bolts from here, 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 and here. I have the 4 fasteners off. There are bolts on this side, nuts on this side. To get the cover off, you're gonna have to take that oil filter cap off. The filler cap is off. This will just pop right off. Next thing I want to do here is disconnect the ignition coils. To do that on this vehicle, you simply pull up on this tab, and that'll cause that to unplug. Once you have all 6 ignition coils unplugged, you simply twist and pull, and they will come out. You pull them out. You see that I've labeled mine just so I don't mix them up when I reinstall them. Next thing you want to do is loosen the tabs here on this shroud that's holding the wiring harness for the ignition coils. So there's looks to be 2 tabs on this car to pop back. Just be careful you don't break them, as they are plastic. And the older the car is, the more brittle they may be. Okay, I have that loose. Once that is loose, you'll need an 8mm socket and socket wrench to loosen this ground wire. It's an orange ground wire in this car. And once that's off, we'll just move that out of the way and set it somewhere on the driver's side. Here's a closer look at those tabs that were holding that's the harness shroud on here. There was 2 on the top, 1, 2 here, and there's actually 3 on the bottom. I didn't have to pry at the bottom ones. Once I had them clipped off on these top 2, it just popped right off. What you want to do is there's a second harness that's sitting below that harness shroud I just removed that sits in these clips. It's attached to the valve cover, so we'll just pop these out and get those out of the way. Just clip back here as well, if you can see that. Just get those wires out of the way. Just a heads up, if you haven't replaced this hose on your car, I have, if it's got the original hose on it, it's likely that it's very, very brittle and may break on you when you're moving this harness around. You can pick up those hoses pretty much at any parts store. I believe it's a 3/16 line I used, vacuum line. Okay, the next thing I need to do before we remove the valve cover is to unclasp or disconnect this breather hose. So you just grab it here at those plastic marks, top and bottom, and wiggle it. It should pop off. Again, this is a plastic hose, and if you have never replaced it, it could be pretty brittle. This one's been replaced. Just gonna undo that. And then the next thing we need to do is remove all these 10mm fasteners. So there's 3 along the bottom of the valve cover, 3 along the top, 3 around the back, 3 around the front. To get the valve cover off, we need to remove all the 10mm fasteners that are holding it in place. There's 4 10mm fasteners across the middle of the valve cover, 3 along the top, 3 along the bottom, 3 around the back of the valve cover, and 3 around the front. Okay, I have all the fasteners off the valve cover. Just one thing I did before I'm going to pull it off is I had a bit of grit that was accumulated around the edges of the valve cover and a bit in here, so I took my shop vac to vacuum that out so we didn't have any grit falling into the head and the valve. So you just pull your valve cover off. If you're having trouble getting it off, you can just get a small pry tool in under the edges and start to pry it off. Since I'm only a one-man show here, I'll pull it off and then we'll carry on. Now that we have the valve cover off, we want to clean all the mating surfaces before reinstallation. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm going to do a Vanos rebuild on this job before I do that. But you want to make sure your mating surface is completely cleaned off before you install your new gasket and reinstall the valve cover. It's just a shot of the bottom side of the valve cover. The gasket pretty much came off with the valve cover. I got stuck in a couple spots, but came out fairly easily. Okay, before I install the gaskets on the back of the valve cover, I'm doing a quick inspection here to make sure no chunks of old broken gasket have fallen in into the head here. If so, we'll pick those out. So I was having the smell of burning oil occasionally after driving the car. Sometimes I could smell it while I was driving the car. While I was cleaning up the surfaces around the head, I didn't see any points that were evident to me that it was leaking from the sides. One sign of that would be like oil spilt on these heat shields here. See this heat shield here and here? Doesn't look too bad. So it's likely that the oil burning smell I was getting was oil leaking through the gaskets into one of the spark plug holes, and I suspect it might have been that one because it was a little dirtier. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put a very small bead of RTV sealant on these seams where the Vanos meets the head, and on these corner of these 180-degree roundouts on the front and the back of the head, just to ensure I have no leaks down the road. Okay, here's a look at the back of the valve cover. I've pulled the old gasket out. This one's out as well. Before we install the new gaskets, depending on the age of your car, your gasket, the old gasket could have been brittle, and you may have some pieces that have broken off. Just make sure there's no debris, large debris inside the back of the valve cover, and then we can reinstall the new gaskets. Just want to point out these two tabs here. This is a plastic valve cover gasket, so obviously with age they become more brittle. So just be careful when you're pulling your valve cover off or installing it that you don't break these plastic tabs off. There's two here and two there. So in addition to replacing the gaskets on the bottom side of the valve cover, I'm also going to replace the rubber grommets or gaskets that are around each of the 15 fasteners that hold the valve cover down. So simply just pop the old grommet out, which has a washer on top of it, like so. Take your fasteners, slip your washer on, and then slip on a new rubber grommet, narrow side down. Just to remind you, if you have your valve cover face down when you're removing these old grommets and the washer, again, be careful you don't break these plastic tabs. I've cleaned up all the fasteners and installed the washers and the new grommets. Next we're going to do is pop in the gaskets for the spark plug openings. Just like that. Make sure they're seated in all the way. Next we'll install the main valve cover gasket. Just need to make sure it's seated in all the way once you have it in place. As I mentioned, I'm going to put a little bit of RTV on the head here, 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 and where the Vanos cover meets the head. Let it cure a little bit and then install the cover. Okay, I have a very small amount of RTV at these two seams and these corner spots, and also at the back. I don't have the fast drying RTV, so I'm going to put the valve cover on, hand tighten the fasteners, let it cure for an hour and then torque it to specs. I have the valve cover in place. You just want to be careful when you're placing it on the head to ensure that these vacuum lines and electrical cables are not pinched at the back of the valve cover here and here. I'm going to put on the fasteners and leave them hand tight for an hour before I torque it down. I have all the fasteners on hand tight. I'm just going to wait for them to cure, and then the torque setting for this is 10 Newton meters or 88.5 inch-pounds. When you torque your valve cover down, you want to work from the center out, so you want to start here, here, there, here, crisscross to here, back here, up here, etc. And kind of in a star pattern until it's all torqued down. Okay, my RTV is cured for an hour, so I'm ready to torque the fasteners down. Again, you want to do it in a star pattern, working from the inside out, and torque settings 10 Newton meters or 88.5 inch-pounds. Okay, I have all the fasteners torqued down to the correct torque setting, and I want to replace my ignition coils. Some of the earlier model coils differ, but in this particular model you just push them on. So these are the clips I'm talking about, where you need to slip these loose wires back into the clips. There's 2 electrical wires and 1 vacuum line. One here, one there. And then there's some plastic channels to guide the vacuum line around the back of the valve cover. Now we need to reconnect the ignition coil harness. We'll swing that back around. There's 6 coils we need to reconnect and the single orange ground wire. Which I believe was an 8mm nut. So just push it in. Clip it down. And put the nut back on the ground wire. Now this housing for the ignition coil clipped into the bottom of the valve cover, so you clip it back in place. If you haven't done so already, you need to reconnect your ventilation, crankcase air ventilation tube. Pretty much job complete, just to replace the covers and the cabin filter housing and cabin filter, which we have on a separate video, and replace the clutch fan and the radiator shroud. Get the engine covers back on. Next in is the cabin filter. That's pretty much